Hello, I'm Dan Hickey. I'm coming to you from my office in the Center for Research on Learning and Technology at Indiana University, where I'm an Associate Professor of Learning Sciences. I'm here to talk to you today about educational assessment. This is the second in a series of short videos that are designed to help teachers, educators, administrators, researchers, faculty, anyone else who's involved in education. Today we're going to talk about one of the very simple item formats, selected response items. You may know them as multiple choice items. They're really the easiest format to make, but they're one of the hardest formats to make well. Generally speaking, in assessment, there's 4 different categories of item formats. The first that we'll be talking about today is selected response. The second is constructed response. This includes short answer, essay items. Performance assessments are more open-ended, more problem-solving formats. And then finally, portfolio assessment. Selected response formats are really the most popular. You're very familiar with them. Cognitive scientists have shown that you can learn something at the level needed to recognize whether you've seen it before almost instantly. Furthermore, you'll be able to remember that recognition level knowledge for a long time. This creates 2 problems. One is that most knowledge used in the real world needs to actually be recalled rather than just recognized if you're going to use it. And that really requires it to be understood much more deeply. The second problem is that it's really easy to give away the answer to selected response items in your instruction. A problem that I've seen a lot over the years is that teachers will inadvertently give away, they'll both mention the correct answer, but they'll also use the incorrect answer as their items as counterexamples in their narratives and in their lectures. That's really problematic for the reasons I was just saying. Each of these 4 item formats have their advantages and disadvantages. The big advantage with selected response formats is that they're so easy to make and they're so quick to complete. Students can complete a lot of items in a short period of time. The disadvantage are some of the ones that I mentioned already. The important thing is if you are going to use selected response formats, you want to learn how to use the correct item format for the job. Generally speaking, there's 4 types of selected response item formats. I'm going to start with the familiar multiple choice format because that's the one that I use most commonly, and probably if you use these formats is the one that you'll be most familiar with. It's pretty easy to write these items, and when they're done well, you get a lot of information really fast, and you can, if you know what you're doing, really get at sort of deeper understanding. The multiple choice item is made up in an initial statement called the stem, and then the item alternatives, which is the answer choice. The incorrect answer choices are called distractors. Again, I started with this format because it's the one that's most relevant to me. You're going to want to think about which ones are most relevant to you. The second type of selected response item format is called binary multiple choice. This is where there are a number of binary choice, true-false items with a single sort of stem or stimulus. It's a really difficult format. I really want you to take a minute and sort of think about it because for some of you, you may find that the binary multiple choice format is ideal. The third type of selected response items are called matching items. This is where you have multiple items on one side and a bunch of items on the other side. The premise are the items on the left. The response is the item on the right. We'll go back over that. Finally, binary choice is the one that you're all familiar with, often used with younger students. Simple, true, false. Before we get into the specific item formats, I want to talk about 5 general item writing guidelines. Now, James Popham has popularized these items. You'll find these in a lot of different places. I really want you to get familiar with these guidelines and spend some time using them in your own work and thinking about which ones are most relevant to you. First, write clear instructions for your test. This is the most relevant one to me because sometimes I spend a lot of time working on my items, but then I really screw up the instructions and I end up with students coming up and saying, is this what you mean? So it's really important. You want to go back, step away from your assessment or actually have a student look at the instructions and say, do these make sense? Do you know exactly what to do? The second guideline in writing all forms of assessment is simple syntax. Now I have a real problem with this one because I do a lot of scholarly writing. I don't have such a problem with vocabulary, but I really do get sort of carried away with some fancy syntax that really doesn't belong in any assessment formats unless it's really a part of the sort of knowledge I want to assess. The third guideline is avoid ambiguous statements. Now, you might think that this is a way of making things a little more difficult. It's not true. It just doesn't work. Don't be ambiguous. Try to be crystal clear. Students shouldn't be confused about what you're getting at. One that I don't really have a lot of problem with, but a lot of people who take my classes do, is providing unintentional clues. There's little ways that your students will discover that you'll signal what the correct or the most likely correct answer is. We'll return to that. Finally, vocabulary. Again, I pretty much got this one down in my own work. I think I've learned how to make items that use the appropriate vocabulary. Now, I do think it's important for you to use the actual vocabulary that you're using in your class, the same language, the same terms. But this is an issue for many educators, though. They will try to, so for instance, in mathematics and word problems, they'll really sort of dumb it down. You don't really need to do that. It should match the level of your typical students. In his textbook, Jim Popham gives a set of guidelines that are specific to making good multiple choice items. Again, I'm going to talk about these in the order that I find the most relevant in my own work. The first one concerns the STEM. That's the beginning of this item. Which of the following test item types is the most commonly used type in the United States? Now, notice that that was a self-contained statement. Your test taker wouldn't have to go and look at the responses to figure out what they were being asked. Now, I put that one first because I used to make items that didn't do that, and I realized that students were struggling with them. The second one is keep the item alternatives or responses in equal length. You don't want to give away the answer or unintentional clues. And by the way, in terms of number of responses, 4 or 5 is typically the best. 6 is getting to be quite a bit and kind of overkill. 3 is not really quite enough except for younger kids typically. Then you want to consider page layout. This is not the time to save paper. You want to have a lot of white space on your tests. You don't want to have students flipping pages. You want to consider spacing when designing multiple choice binary and matching items. Another guideline is randomly assign correct answers. Don't have the predominant, don't use C too much. Students will recognize that stuff. Another guideline that might surprise you is never use all of the above, but consider using none of the above to make items harder. This is probably the most relevant guideline to many of you. None of the above works in a squirrely way. For example, students may see the very first thing, the A response, and select that one because they're in a hurry and not get to the all of the above. Likewise, students might see 2 of them, but not know the other 2, the third and the fourth, and select all of the above. So just generally avoid it. However, none of the above is actually a very effective tool for making items more difficult. Finally, you shouldn't use negative stems in which you say, the following is not an example of. Students will often overlook the not, and it generally makes for confusing items. Now, in some cases, you may have a good reason for using negative items. If you do, make sure you really highlight that it is a negative item with bold, italic, capitals, or something like that. So the multiple binary choice item is a format you may not be familiar with, but I think it's one you might want to consider. Popham and other assessment specialists have been advancing this item format for a long time. They're hard to use, but they really accomplish something pretty special. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit and suggest maybe you give it some consideration. Research has shown that this format is reliable and can capture a range of difficulty about a particular kind of thing. So if you take a look at that example item there, right, it's really just 3 true-false binary items, but there's 3 of them about the same stimulus. Now that particular item really quickly is going to tell you how much a student knows, in this case, about measures of central tendency. One thing I really love about the multiple binary choice format is it's really simple for you to go in and change the stimulus and then those responses in a way that makes it impossible for students who've been seeing these items to memorize the answers. In other words, it's a very good item format for doing both formative and summative assessment, particularly in mathematics, but in other domains as well. There's a couple of guidelines for doing this. The real guideline is give yourself some time, know your material really well, but you want to coordinate the items with the stems. Obviously, all of the items need to be about the stem. They need to hold very closely together, like these 3 items do. Otherwise, you're just going to have separate items, right? It doesn't make sense to coordinate them. And the second guideline is to really help students understand what's going on here, especially if it's the first time or the second time students have seen them or you only have one of them on an assessment. Notice how I put a little mark at the top of it to signify this is the stimulus at the beginning, and then I've clearly broken out those items so they can clearly see what's going on with this item. Then there's the familiar binary choice, often called true-false. You can actually use other stimulus. You can say appropriate, correct, various things. Now, people make a lot of fun of true-false items. They're mostly used with younger kids, but in some situations where you have a lot of stuff you want to cover, and especially if the stuff you want to cover is arbitrary knowledge, very factual knowledge, anatomy, capitals, what have you, binary choice assessments can really get at a whole bunch of stuff really fast because they're so quick to complete. When you create binary choice items, there's a few things you need to keep in mind. Again, I'm going to focus on the guidelines that I've taken from Popham's book that are most relevant to me. For me, the most relevant is to phrase the items so that they elicit thoughtfulness and that superficial knowledge yields the wrong answer. This is a good one. This is where you really need to know your content. If you do it right, you can create a binary choice item where the student who is familiar but not knowledgeable with the material will actually choose the incorrect response. And those can do a really good job of identifying and differentiating how much your students know. This is what professional item writers do. It's a good thing to get practice with. Spend time thinking about what it means to know something at a shallow level, to recognize something that's familiar, and they say, oh, I've seen that before, but the more knowledgeable student will recognize the other one that's not as recognizable, but is actually true. The second guideline is to avoid double concept items and include only one concept in each statement. This one's pretty relevant to me. I used to do this a lot. I thought I was being clever and making the items harder, but I really realized that I was really just confusing my students. You want to minimize the negatives and never ever use double negatives on these. Or just avoid negatives entirely in this format. You just don't want to make people have to stop and think too much. You want to have approximately equal number of items representing the 2 categories, whether true, false, or some other dichotomy that you choose to use. Finally, keep your items about the same length in each category. I put that one last because that's pretty obvious to me. The final selected response item format I want to talk about today is the matching item. You're probably familiar with this format. The first column is called the premise, and the second column is called the response. Notice that this list is homogeneous in that there are all books on the left and all animals on the right. You don't want to mix that up. Made well, matching items can be quite useful in some settings. But don't forget, we're still dealing with recognition level information. You don't want to use these formats for more deeper, more conceptual stuff. This is for more sort of arbitrary knowledge in language education, right? Where foreign language, where it really is just an arbitrary relationship. Matching formats and all of the selected response formats are worth consideration. Here are some useful guidelines if you're making matching items. The first one is you want to load up on responses. You want more responses than premises, right? So if you look back there, you see that there are more things in column A than there are in column B. This is one that people often overlook. Now, you want to go for brevity. You want to also put the shorter things on the left if you have longer things and the much longer responses on the right. The examples in mine are so short, it doesn't really matter. Homogeneous lists. Don't switch them up. All the stuff in each list should be about the same thing. Next, you want to order your responses logically. alphabetical or chronological order, right? It should be obvious why that they're in that order. Otherwise, students are going to spend time searching for clues in the order you've provided. Then, describe the task clearly to your students. In particular, give complete details, including how many times each of the items can be used. You consider using items more than once, but this is probably going to confuse your students and may not be worth the trouble. Finally, format the items to avoid page flipping. This is kind of a no-brainer, but you don't want students having to turn from one page to the next. Again, tests are not the time to save paper. So in this short video, we've gone over some general item guidelines, as well as the guidelines for 4 specific selected response item formats. What's our takeaway from this? Well, the first big idea about selected response items is that they really have important strengths and weaknesses. They can be administered with computers and can assess a lot of knowledge pretty quickly, but it's really hard to get at the more conceptual, consequential, and critical knowledge with selected response item formats. The second big idea about selected response items is visit and revisit the guidelines. I've given you a set of guidelines here that you can work with. There are other guidelines out there to draw from. Get familiar with them. They should become second nature. Have them, once you're making a test, look at them a lot. Revisit them, make sense of them. The important thing to keep in mind is these guidelines will take on new meaning as you use them and you get better at both understanding the material you're assessing and the way that you're assessing them. Finally, be careful not to compromise your assessments by including the specific associations in your instructions. Again, you don't want to give away the correct and the incorrect responses in your assessment by directly exposing students to them, because it's very easy for them to remember that information and recognize it when it's presented. That's it for our short video on selected response items. I'm Dan Hickey from Indiana University, and I'll see you next time.